Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran and the Game Week 13 cheat sheet. If you haven't watched the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a recap of the sort of tiers of players that I have for the next few weeks in FPL and of course relative to their price, how effective they are, how useful they are considering the fixture difficulty ahead, what we've seen from underlying stats, and also generally what I've heard and seen from manager conferences and things like that. As far as what we know from Game Week 13, I think the biggest news, of course, is that it does seem like Bowen has an injury. So just before I jump into the midfield, I think that's probably the biggest talking point of this week, and that does have some impacts, right, on how we think about the meta of the teams, what the most template, I suppose, midfield is for the time being. Other than that, I think there isn't too much major news other than maybe Matoma as well will miss out in Game Week 13, but we'll dive into those assets when we jump into those price points in a moment. As far as the midfield in terms of the budget tier, you'll see that I have not really changed a Dinger or Palmer, and that's because, of course, with the Matoma injury, Adingra's minutes are secure for now. I still think it's a very, very good hold until Game Week 16. You can make that decision to move into Palmer later on. As far as Palmer, of course, you can even jump into him now. The reality, of course, with the midfield landscape is, unless you're actually willing to, let's say, take the plunge into someone like Eze, then of course you can just sort of tempt yourself with Palmer for the time being. Have someone who should really be lasting within your teams for a long, long time. The only asterisk, I suppose, with Palmer is, of course, what will happen when Nkunku comes in. I personally think Nkunku will be taking away the minutes from someone like Nicholas Jackson, but we still need to see what happens, right? Whether actually minutes from all the attackers will be lost, because, of course, you know that there's a lot of depth with the Chelsea team as well. If, let's say, Mudryk doesn't start, if Madueke doesn't start, those players, of course, will find some minutes in the future, and who's going to give those minutes away? And Palmer obviously might be one of those options. As far as, let's say, the 5.5 plus territory assets, I do think He-Chan gets a fall. Gordon also gets a fall. And a lot of people will be asking the question, why? And I've been owning Gordon all this time. I've also been advocating He-Chan. I just think that the landscape now is that just because Adingra and Palmer do exist and have very, very safe minutes, Palmer, of course, is in a bad fixture run right now, but about to sort of reach its in conclusion in a few weeks' time. And Palmer, of course, will just become a better asset. Whereas with players like He-Chan and Gordon, you're still in relatively average fixture run just because He-Chan just doesn't have a good, clean run of games for Wolves. And as far as Gordon, of course, this is one of Newcastle's, worst fixture runs of the season. Very much, reminiscent of, let's say, the start of the season when they were facing some pretty tough teams. Now, of course, Chelsea United aren't going to be the same quality of teams, let's say Liverpool, Arsenal, and City, but you get my point. As far as Gordon, I just think he falls because with Isaac coming back and more than likely going to take minutes for the next few weeks, you're looking at a landscape where Gordon, of course, is going to be that starting left winger. And even though there's a lack of depth on both positions, on the left flank and the right flank, Barnes is also pretty close to coming back. And I think the overall concern with Newcastle as well is, how much efficacy is Gordon really going to have? Do we always invest into, let's say, wingers from really strong attacking teams? I think Arsenal is a very good example of that. But do we like to invest in them in a tougher fixture schedule? And I think right now with Gordon, this is sort of what you're looking at. There's an opportunity to jump off potentially on Game Week 14. But you can also continue to hold Gordon if you really think he's a season keeper. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with Gordon. And Gordon will, of course, rise again when it comes to, let's say, Game Week 17 onwards when Newcastle have really good fixtures. So that's a decision that you have to make as a manager. Do you have any sort of short-term upside options to jump into? And I think with He-Chan and Gordon, there is. As far as Johnson, he's almost on the opposite end where his end of poor fixtures really comes, at the end of, let's say, that City fixture in Game Week 14. So after Game Week 14, really, Johnson becomes a very good asset. And if, let's say, you don't want to wait for Palmer in Game Week 16, or you don't want to jump onto Palmer as soon as Game Week 14, I mean, why not just step into someone like Johnson in Game Week 15, right? He's an option where the fixtures are very, very good for Spurs. And as an attacker at 5.8 million for the Spurs team, I think Johnson is at a ridiculous price. So the question, of course, is whether he continues to keep minutes, because right now, of course, he is still the most, I would say, replaceable player within this team. Richarlison, of course, was only destined to be out for 1 month as per Ange. So we'll see, of course, in 2 to 3 weeks' time, whether we get more news on Richarlison coming back, whether that's going to be, something that's delayed, whether Johnson will basically have free access to starting left wing minutes for the time, and also see what happens as well with, let's say, someone like Brian Gill, who's actually coming back and taking on, substitute minutes really for Johnson off the bench. And we'll see, of course, how that develops, how that relationship intertwines, because I do think Ange has also spoken quite highly of Brian in the past, but we'll see, of course, what happens to Johnson's minutes. As far as, let's say, the 6.x territory, I think you're seeing a change here simply due to injuries, right? We talked about Bowen's injury. We talked about Mitoma not being available likely for Game Week 13. That's why Mitoma falls. There's no particular reason why Mitoma has fallen this hard other than the fact that we think that he's going to miss this Nottingham Forest fixture. And if you miss this Nottingham Forest fixture, then actually the fixture run is a little bit more average, right? So what is the point really of keeping Mitoma when you can just jump onto Mbeumo at a home fixture? Will definitely play this week as well, giving you a chance at an attacking return in a week where a lot of people have bad matchups anyways. And you get to save, let's say, the price sort of advantage of Mbeumo, who's probably subject to rise, as far as a similar sort of thing here, where you're tapping into 3 fixtures in a row where I would say they're very, very good fixtures for Crystal Palace, just because West Ham haven't been a particularly good team from the defensive point of view, more likely, because what we've seen in terms of looking at the underlying stats of the team so far. West Ham have been very poor. Luton, of course, the same. And Bournemouth, that being a home fixture, just makes it elite. So there is a genuine advantage here to, I would say, jumping to Eze for 3 weeks. And maybe, of course, if you're, let's say, someone who doesn't own Mbeumo, then you can think about jumping onto him this week, or just simply Game Week 14, where, of course, the true good fixture starts. So that's the landscape there. We also know that Kudus was taken off from international duty as well with his own injury. So we'll need to sort of monitor that situation because, of course, Kudus being out, Antonio being out, Bowen being out, that's going to be so impactful for West Ham. That's obviously going to weaken their attack, first of all. But second of all, who's going to take those minutes? We could even see someone like Mubama come in. But I think for now, Kudus is still quite safe. We just need to make sure that, he's totally fine. I think, of course, in terms of his minutes, if Bowen and Antonio are out, then he's going to be the one who's going to benefit the most. Because if you think about, let's say, the fixture scheduling from Game Weeks 13 to 16, you don't actually have too much time to rest. So if you're an injured player over this period, you're very likely to miss 3 to 4 fixtures in a row. And that allows for someone like Kudus to step in. So Kudus, of course, will continue to rise if we get better news. And of course, that's going to be unfortunate news, right? On the other hand, for Bowen and Antonio. As far as Diaby, I still think he's conveniently placed in this position. The issue for me, as I mentioned last week and reiterated, was Tielemans. The rise of Tielemans, unfortunately, means that now you have 2 players who can actually come off the bench and actually play for this Aston Villa team, in Bailey and in Tielemans. And it might be the case that Diaby continues to keep his starting spot, but you don't want to see a player getting subbed off at 61 minutes. That's just simply the case. As far as Doku and Sterling, still differentials for now until the fixtures for both players get better. As far as the 7.x sort of price point, I do think that this position has weakened a little bit because I think with Martinelli and Trossard, you still have, for example, let's say Jesus close to coming back, and that's going to have an impingement on, let's say, Martinelli's minutes. We saw him play 89 minutes in the previous game versus Burnley, but how guaranteed are Martinelli's minutes compared to, let's say, someone like Bukayo Saka, who actually seems to be, fit once again? So in that sort of landscape, I do think Martinelli is still unfortunate option who has to fall, or at least, should be retained in that sort of yellow price point. And then when we're talking about someone like Bowen here, I think the risk really with someone like Bowen is, of course, this sort of situation where the news is that he has fluid in his knees, right? And we talk about the fixture congestion over Game Weeks 13 to 16. This is going to have an impact on Bowen. He might miss out 2 fixtures. And if he misses out on 2 fixtures, that's it. There's no value really to owning Bowen right now. So I do think it makes sense to jump off of Bowen this week. If you've been able to capture price rises, that's great. If you're really keen on holding on to Bowen, I'd probably ask yourself the question, how much advantage is Bowen going to be if you can only get him for Game Week 15? We'll try and see what the full sort of forecast on Bowen's injury is going to be. But even if it's short term, I think the issue is how short term is it going to be? Because is he coming back for the Crystal Palace home fixture? And if not, then I don't really think that Bowen actually has much value, in the immediate future. So it makes sense to jump off Bowen, save yourself a little bit of money and maybe find the way to sort of, reorientate your team planning ahead for Game Week 18 and that blank. As far as the 8.x players and above, no changes there really. I think Saka and Son, these are players who are obviously nailed to their teams, who are, more than likely penalty takers as well in the right situation, and of course have decent fixtures. In Son's case, of course, it's a little bit opposite, where I'd say Arsenal have 3 good fixtures in a row, whereas with Son, of course, you've got 2 bad fixtures, but the reality is Son is actually such a good keep, and also he is one of those prime candidate options, first of all, for a captaincy this week, just because captaincy options are so poor, but then also secondly, one of the best captaincy options in Game Week 18 when you can reassess, let's say, whether you want to take out someone like Son ahead of AFCON. And I think it makes sense when you look at, let's say, Liverpool's fixtures compared to Spurs around that time, that actually you'd probably be taking out, let's say, either Mbeumo or maybe Salah in Game Week 18 instead, as opposed to Son. But do have a look at the fixture schedule in the future and you make your own thoughts and assessments on that. As far as the forward position, there has been actually quite a few changes, right? The reality right now is, I think, within the budget spots, not many of these players actually have guaranteed minutes because we lost Lyle Foster recently. and I won't talk about that. But I mean, with Edouard, of course, he's the one who probably benefits the most, just in terms of, first of all, guaranteed minutes, and then second of all, really good fixtures for 3 fixtures in a row, right? So from Edouard's point of view, I think he's the one who actually benefits the most in the short term, and that's why Edouard is going to get a rise, because you're looking at a player here who has pretty much 80 minutes a game for this Crystal Palace team at the bare minimum. And of course, even though we know Mateta can be a player who can sort of replace him at times, it's not really always like for like replacements. We've seen them play 2 up front. Edouard's position in the team is relatively safe, at least under Roy Hodgson, at least under what we've seen so far from Roy Hodgson. So I do think that Edouard's a great option. Calvert-Lewin is also that second great option too, where I think with Calvert-Lewin, you're sort of looking at a player here who very much mimics what Edouard brings to the table, but more and in terms of the penalties. But of course, the concern, of course, is if let's say Calvert-Lewin has some pretty bad fixtures, or he plays poorly in some of these fixtures rather, then of course someone like Beto can actually step in. Whereas I think with Edouard so far, I'd be a bit more confident about him sort of locking out 80 minutes a game. With Calvert-Lewin, sometimes it's the case that he could be subbed off at 70 minutes, and that's also a little bit of a concern. And just when you compare fixtures, of course, they're not the same at Crystal Palace's. As far as João Pedro, he falls. I know Ferguson actually has an injury, and that's, of course, a cause for huge concern, right? Because Ferguson pretty much actually left before the international break with an injury, and then actually was re-injured once again during the international break when he was playing for his national team. So you're now looking at a situation where it should make sense, right? It should make sense for João Pedro to be a great pick, but I'm still concerned with the minutes, because it doesn't seem like, of course, he's gotten good minutes in the Premier League. And the reality, of course, is that unfortunately we've missed out on Everton at home. We've missed out on Sheffield United at home. Just can't guarantee that João Pedro is going to be good value over tough fixtures, and maybe Ferguson's injury is actually not as severe as we might be able to expect. So in that landscape, with Brighton continuing to rotate for the rest of the season, and let's say players like Adingra and Matoma actually getting the larger share of the minutes when it comes to rotation within this team, because the wing positions are very, very clearly separate from the central positions dictated by De Zerbi, right? So when you see Lallana and Welbeck come back into the team, they will only take central spots, whereas with Adingra and Matoma, I mean, they're really only competing with each other. And then also Buonanotte, who really just has completely flattered to deceive this season. And it's very, very clear so far that the reason why Adingra's had gotten such good minutes is because Buonanotte has not shown the ability to sort of step up to the level that Roberto De Zerbi wants. And that's why I think the landscape for the forwards is much worse than for Brighton than, let's say, the midfielders. As far as Awoniyi and Ferguson and even Solanke, these sort of options at the 6.8 price range, I think we have some changes once again, where, of course, Solanke, look, ultimately has 2 great fixtures back-to-back. He might even be a captaincy, a very rogue captaincy option. If you want to back someone, if you're thinking, let's say, previously for Bowen, right, targeting one of those promoted teams and targeting the sort of away fixture there, then, of course, you could just sort of look at Solanke at one of those options. Once again, a penalty taker, a 90-minute player, and someone who should, stand to benefit in such a good fixture. As far as Awoniyi, I think he's just a little bit worse, right? Sometimes has less minutes, sometimes ultimately just doesn't have penalties, and the underlying stats are fairly comparable to someone like Solanke, right? He's got a higher expected goals involvement per 90, but it's not enough, I would say, to sort of mimic the gulf in, first of all, fixtures, and then second of all, the penalties that Solanke has. As far as Ferguson, the back injury is just what I talked about. And in terms of the 7.x position, just moving on there, you've got Alvarez and Darwin at the top, and I think what we need to do is just, cast our eyes out to Nkunku and Isaac. I don't think jumping on to Nkunku and Isaac makes sense. I think Isaac will actually get a lot of minutes, but keep in mind, of course, that what we've seen so far is when, let's say, Isaac or Wilson are the only fit players for Newcastle playing at those centre forward positions, I don't think Isaac's going to get 90 minutes, back-to-back football. They have to compete on multiple competitions. This is the issue that Newcastle are facing, and there is no way that Isaac will be playing 90 minutes a game. And not to mention that Newcastle's fixtures are very, very tough. So in that landscape, I think Isaac is more of a wait and see how much money he gets, see how well he's playing, and then wait for him, really. Wait for him until game week 17, or at least wait until the Chelsea fixture is done. Then maybe you can move into him and target Man United if you'd really like to do so. So those are my thoughts in terms of Isaac for now. I wouldn't be transferring him in the short term. I do think Solanke is a great option when we're thinking about, let's say, options to move into at good price points, at a budget price point as well. And another thing to talk about with Alvarez, of course, is the consideration of free hit 18, right? If you're, let's say, investing into City defenders in the future, or you have a plan to invest into City defenders, you do have to consider how many City players am I really carrying onto Game Week 18 and that blank. If I'm not creating it on 18, does it make sense to continue to hold Alvarez? If not, I do think, of course, you've got Solanke as an option. You've also got Darwin as a very easy pivot option next week. But that's the landscape, right? Darwin has been incredible, extremely incredible for Uruguay under Marcelo Bielsa as well, but specifically under Liverpool, where he has turned a new leaf within this team, and we've seen a lot of really glowing comments from Klopp and Pep Linders that basically suggest that Darwin should be the first sort of play starting player for this team. In my opinion, the concern, of course, is going to be 14, 15, 16. Liverpool will inevitably rotate. And the question, of course, is going to be how many minutes can Darwin play? I just think because the fixtures are so good between 14 and 16, and he's more than likely, going to get a little bit of rest for Game Week 13 as well, given the international break and the way Liverpool usually manage these situations. I actually think Darwin's still a great option. And I think for Game Week 14, he's going to be one of those priority options, undoubtedly, and even for my team. So in terms of Watkins, I have been reconsidering whether he actually really deserves to be sort of that second tier asset. And I do think he still does, just because now we've got Solanke, as a very true, for example, replacement option for Watkins, right? Someone who at a cheaper price point plays 90 minutes, gets good chances per minute, and of course has penalties, right? And an additional advantage over Watkins. And now because we have some steady options that I think can generally replace Watkins in that second spot, I do think Watkins still deserves to be that second tier. But we also have to reconsider that Watkins is actually an extremely powerful option for Game Week 18. But actually, one thing I would want to consider as well is by Game Week 18, the template's probably going to slowly already move to a 3-4-3. If you think about all the players heading towards the Asian Cup and the AFCON, Salah will leave, Son will leave, and Bouma will leave. Now, that's way more into the future. That's probably Game Week 22 onwards. But in reality, the teams that we're going to be crafting are going to be 3-4-3 based, right? Because now that you've taken out three of the best midfielders of the game, you're going to be getting probably forwards who are actually going to replace their spots. And they will be better options as a result, right? Because that's how you can choose to spend your money at that time. So I do think around that time, Watkins is no longer really competing in the template 3-5-2 in Game Week 18 with other players like Alvarez, Darwin, or Solanke, but rather actually you have the option to get a third striker, and that can just be Watkins. As far as the defenders now, just move on over there. There have been a lot of changes that I've made. Livramento, he does get a fall, unfortunately, with I think the reality is with Newcastle, maybe I actually overstepped the mark in terms of predicting Livramento's minutes. I think the reality is that Livramento is definitely, seen ahead of Lewis Hall in terms of, let's say, his ability to actually play starting minutes. But Newcastle have also been trying to rotate as much as possible. And you can see that, of course, where there is an option to, let's say, play Lewis Hall, Eddie Howe will take that. And I think that's a concern for Livramento, who, in my opinion, can actually very comfortably play left back and has shown that he can comfortably play left back, particularly when, let's say, Newcastle are struggling, right? For example, in the game versus Bournemouth, where they were struggling already in the first half, Livramento came on, he took Lewis Hall's minutes, and that's something that you'll probably see later on in the season, where, of course, when Newcastle, with their fixture congestion, have around 10 fixtures in 31 days, we're probably going to see more often than not Livramento over Lewis Hall. But I think the concern that, of course, Lewis Hall can take some minutes away from Livramento at any time does make him worse as an option. And I think with Lascelles, I have to put an asterisk over him because I'm not really sure what the Botman news is. We got them very mixed news in the international break. We first of all got Botman running on grass, which is good. And then obviously news that maybe a second opinion would mean that Botman's going to be out for a long time. And because we haven't gotten an official update from Eddie Howe, and we still don't really exactly know what the updates are in terms of Botman and what experts have said really about his sort of injury condition and how to manage it, I don't really know that really has a huge impact on Lascelles. We need to just wait for press conference news from Eddie Howe to be able to assess adequately how good Lascelles is. With Guehi and Mitchell, they just have great fixtures still in the short term, in the immediate term, which is why, of course, they're still great picks. With Castagna, I've added him as a differential. I've also added many other differentials here, and you'll see, and I'll explain each one by one. With Castagna, I think the use case of Castagna is really, if you look at your team in the future, right, and you see Game Week 13 is a terrible fixture, Game Week 18, you might have terrible fixtures within your team, then Castagna makes a lot of sense, because if Fulham actually were to ever have good fixtures, it's Game Week 13 and 18. So that's where Castagna can sort of plug holes within your team. Then, moving on, I think we've got Maguire, who falls just because United's fixtures are getting worse. With Ait Nouri, you're looking at a player who actually has, once again, the ability to sort of plug some holes, right? For example, Game Week 13 is not too bad. Wolves ultimately are a team where they have sort of AB type fixtures. It's like Fulham, then it's Arsenal, then it's Burnley, actually. So good, bad, good, bad. But I think the concern with Wolves, of course, is that they're not so great in Game Week 18. So, for example, the use case, for example, like in Castagna's sense, isn't adequately filled. But you could still see, for example, someone like Ait Nouri is a very good option if you really want to plug in that hole in Game Week 13. And let's say you have overall more confidence in Wolves, as well as the fact that Ait Nouri is a very, very attacking fullback, right? The reality is he almost plays like a winger, like a left mid. And so that has a huge impact on, let's say, his ability to get expected goals, right? It's sort of reminding of, let's say, when Cash scored 2 goals versus Burnley this season, it's because, of course, he was playing out of position. So if you want to tap into that, then of course there's the differential there with Aït-Nouri. As far as Konsa, you're looking at someone who unfortunately just doesn't have any good fixtures in the short term, but truly is just a replacement for Cash, right? If you think about what Cash is good for the rest of the time out for your team, it's probably game week 18. He fills in a great hole there, has a great fixture, probably the best fixture, right, of that week, which is why, of course, Watkins will be a captaincy option then. But when you look at, let's say, Cash, I mean, maybe if, let's say, you're dismayed by him, or just given the fact that he's gotten so many price rises, probably is a little bit overpriced considering to what we can expect, I would say Konsa is a great option who can just pretty much cover Cash, give you some money back in your team, and probably benefit you there. As far as Pinnock, the question, of course, is, are you preparing for a free at 18? And if you're preparing for a free at 18, then it makes sense to tap into the fact that Brentford actually have really, really good defensive fixtures after the Arsenal game. So Pinnock is, of course, going to be a differential. But the question mark, of course, is going to be around whether you're free at 18 or not. As far as Saliba, still top option, the 5.x player price point. And with Porro, I think the reason why I've given him a rise is because what we've seen with Maddison out is that Porro actually takes a lot more set pieces. So, of course, as a defender, if I was to compare him to Yodogi, even though he's so much more expensive, he does benefit, right? Because as a free kick taker, you have that attacking upside where you can generally justify, even though Spurs' defense on paper look awful, that Porro is going to be someone who benefits. And not to mention, of course, game week 18 is still a relatively good fixture there. As far as James, he's also being added. I have no reason to, for example, add him as a top option now, but it seems like James is close to full fitness, and a healthy James is very good for FPL and diversity within the defensive positions, and also gives us reason to spend money in those positions. Of course, James's fixtures aren't particularly good now. I do think that you can just consider to wait for James, even though he is actually, of course, one of those attacking fullbacks in the league who actually generally, you could argue at times, feels like he could be essential, right? As long as he is firing on all cylinders and is actually playing more than 60 minutes a game. So far, what we've seen is that this Chelsea team have protected James as much as possible. He's basically played 60 minutes a game and then he gets hooked off. Now, what we want to do is have James, let's say, in a few weeks' time and actually have him playing effectively 80 to 90 minutes a game and that sort of being our situation to jump onto James in the future. As far as Walker, I think he's the most nailed City player, so that's why he's there. With White, haven't got an update from Arteta in terms of his injury, but he's still, in my opinion, a little bit overpriced, right, as a defender. And given the fact that he's not as nailed as Saliba, I think he does deserve a fall because of the injury condition and the asterisks. Now, if let's say Arteta clears it all up, I still think that Tomiyasu has played more than good enough to be able to actually cover both White and Zinchenko at any odd time, which I think, of course, is a concern. And then with, let's say, the more premium defenders, unfortunately, as we've said, with let's say, Alexander-Arnold's underlying stats actually being very, very poor in comparison to last season, and no sort of huge changes being made there, because positioning, we're not seeing, for example, Trent get into those really juicy spots that he did when he was sort of playing like a hybrid position last season. The concern, of course, is going to be, I think Trent still has not much value within FPL. With Trippier, of course, it's just a case where I think it still makes sense to hold him if you don't have any other issues within your team, or let's say, on the other hand, you actually have more issues to deal with. But Trippier isn't a huge glaring problem, because within a few fixtures time, 4 to 5 game weeks later, Trippier is going to be a great option by game week 17. So I don't think there's a huge concern with Trippier. Now, moving on towards the goalkeepers here, I think with Areola, unfortunately, he gets a fall because West Ham's underlying stats have gotten worse and worse. From around the time when we first started wildcarding in terms of game weeks 8 to 10, which is where the majority of players wildcarded. I understand, of course, people wildcarded earlier or have wildcarded since. But the reality is, of course, Areola's underlying stats with this West Ham team, more specifically, have been very poor. Areola has still been very good at shot stopping, but West Ham's underlying stats suggest that they're actually more comparable to the sort of teams that are destined for relegation in Bournemouth, in, let's say, Luton, in Sheffield United, and even Burnley, specifically those last 3 teams that I mentioned. Now, the concern, of course, with Areola, in my opinion, is that unfortunately, that's not good enough, right? At 4.3, you've got access to Pickford at 4.4, and simply put, you've got players like Sanchez and Raya, or even Flecken, who, in my opinion, are the top 3 keepers right now in the game that you can move into. Flecken, I would say, is a great chance for game week 14 if you have, for example, just the luxury to do so. As far as Raya and Sanchez, I think they're more stable keepers for the rest of the season, where I think they will definitely end up, top 4, top 5 in expected goals conceded, and therefore just be really good keeper options. The question with Raya, of course, is just going to be about Ramsdale, and with Sanchez, it just seems like Chelsea have no plans. So that's the landscape. And I think with, of course, some of those really overpriced keepers, of course, Alisson has done incredibly so far, but of course, Liverpool's fixtures will come to an end. And the question, of course, is, once again, you'll have to sort of be spending money to move out of the keeper or into another keeper. So that sometimes, of course, throws out some difficult situations. Now, that's going to be the goalkeepers and the cheat sheet for Game Week 13. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. And once again, thank you so much to the members of the channel for financially supporting me. And let's try and get ourselves to 20K subscribers at the end of the season.